Hello, good afternoon. Happy Saturday. Yeah, it's 3/4/2023. And today we are getting back into The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple by E.A.E. Reymond. Awesome. Hey, esoteric alchemistic, welcome in. I hope you're having a good start to your weekend, man or lady, whoever you are. So we're getting into chapter 7, The Island of Trampling. The Edfu account gives us convincing evidence that the island of Trampling was essentially the primeval piece of land on which the drama of creation commenced. When we examine the physical appearance of the island, we notice that both islands contained an area of still water, which was regarded as the place where creation occurred. In the island of the egg, it was the pool, which contained the lotus carrying the sun god, and to which a tradition was attached later on that the sun god created it for himself. Although we do not know anything about the origin of the pool in the second island, the picture of it is very detailed. It was undoubtedly a reed pool standing on the marginal land of the island. The Edfu evidence describes it only as in its GS-NBI or area or the edge of reeds. An area of reeds or the edge of reeds. Okay. This pool is said to bear the name WTST-NTR, the elevated seat of the god, which, however, seems to have originated in the circumstances and events connected with this pool during the second period of existence of the island. In the midst of this field of reeds, there seemed to have been the seat of a divine being who is not the sun god, as will be stated below. His resting place is pictured as the pillar, or the DD-pillar. As it is stated that it was made from reeds, the pillar appears to have the same function as the lotus, to carry the god, and it could apparently be replaced by another sacred symbol, a slip of reed, which had a special name, a perch. The god who is believed to rest on this pillar is not described in the surviving part of the myth. We know only that the Egyptians called him PN, or this one, and that only his Ba and his Ka acted in the drama of creation when a new period of the existence of the island dawned. Oh my gosh, so good to see you, Secret Soul. Welcome in. Awesome. Happy Saturday. Massive hugs and loves your way. Cool. Awesome, esoteric alchemistic. We all got to do it just like we feel it. Our hypothesis that this reed pool in the island of Trampling represented the actual spot of creation receives some support from a number of facts described in the second part of the first cosmogonical record. We are convinced that the narrative preserves an original tradition concerning the nucleus of creation for which no parallel can be quoted at present. The part of the record concerned bears the title Arriving at the Field of Reeds. Even the Wetcheset Nieder that restores the ancestors. So it even is in parentheses and field is in parentheses. So the whole title is without those parentheses. Arriving at, well, you kind of have to say field. Arriving at the field of reeds, the Wetcheset Nieder that restores the ancestors. Several interpretations of this episode are possible, but here we draw attention to what is said to have been found in situ at the time when a new generation of gods arrived in that place. Situ, in situation. The narrative refers to two symbols pictured as a DT, WDT, and a TIT. Both expressions are unknown elsewhere, and we may tentatively only suggest the interpretation member of the progenitor and image of the arm. These sacred objects may have been symbols of the creating powers, though the text does not state who were the powers embodied in these symbols. But the creators who were eventually represented by these symbols could hardly have been conceived as living deities. One is tempted to speculate on this matter. In our opinion, it seems logical to infer that these two symbols might represent the natural, nameless forces which created the island. We are acquainted with the belief in two generations of creators who lived in the initial island. We know also that the original nameless power who created the first terrestrial substance and who brought the island into existence by fertilizing the bunt matter, the embryo of the earth, were believed to have been at first insubstantial and have acted as such at the beginning of creation. After they had fulfilled their creative task, they assumed a specific and concrete form, but do not seem to have acted at the time when the new generation of creators appeared on the scene. It follows that their activities were believed to have been limited to a definite period of time, and that when the second generation began to create, the original powers, though remaining in the island and being enshrined in their concrete form, were inert. Since it is nowhere stated that these deities would live in the island in a form which would be like that of the cause or like that of the later NTRW gods, the first generation of creators may have been regarded as having assumed the form of members which were believed to have acted in the initial phase of the creation in general, that is, in the origin of the island. It would follow that the concrete shape of the original creators may have been believed to have been concealed in the earth, in the actual land of the island which they created first. Juicy. Wow. What an idea. We learn from our sources that the Egyptians believed in the divinization. Did I say that right? Divinization of the physical form of the original creators. And their DT embodiment became divine in the sacred mounds of the earth. This belief is nowhere explained in detail, and perhaps the original creators were believed to undergo a metamorphosis in the island, and this possibly gave them what is described in our texts as the DT embodiment. An act of consecration of their final physical form presumably followed, and this is what is probably described in the tradition of a later date as the episode "to make divine in the sacred mounds of the earth." We suspect that the expression I squiggly WTNT squiggly W replaced the name of the original island. There are indeed in the Edfu texts instances which make this surmise possible and show an alternative use of the word IW, island, and I squiggly T, mound, while referring to the same pieces of land in the primeval age. Although no relevant text can be cited, we incline to the opinion that our text alludes to the end of the lifespan of the original creators and acquaints us with the Egyptian view on their fate. The fact that the nameless creators were believed to survive in the island in the form of an image in which they might reside in their mysterious life seems to indicate that this theory may have been derived from the belief in the entering into a body by a divine power. Juicy. Michelle, Bootsy, awesome. Welcome, everyone. Happy Saturday. Happy weekend. I just got my tea all hooked up. This awesome non-dairy creamer. Oh my goodness. It makes my drinks taste like desserts. They're already delicious. Oh, it's too hot, but it's bomb. As far as the island of trampling is concerned, it seems that in the form of the two symbols, the member of the progenitor and the image of the arm, the original creative powers remained in the very place where the creation of the world started. These two symbols might have represented the most sacred object in the homeland of the primeval ones. If this suggestion be accepted, it will emphasize the theory concerning the cultus place of the creator. These symbols might have had yet another function in the island. Their presence in situ may have made it possible for the creation of the world to be carried out. It is certain from the ensuing narrative that the image of the arm was invoked before the start of a new act of creation of the earth. Thus, There would seem to have been a connection between the creation of the substances and the symbol itself. Another hint to support this view is that these symbols are said to have been found in the place where the creator of the earth maker, dwelt. The connection with the connection with the creation of the earth cannot be denied. The Edfu text may disclose the Egyptian view of how they conceived the final appearance of the original creators. Unique as it is, unique as it is, this picture is of importance. The fact that in a field of reeds in the primeval island there were found two symbols representing unspecified creative powers can be taken as decisive evidence that the island of trampling was a primeval island of creation in which the world took origin, in which the nameless powers lived and were enshrined in its land after their lifespan had come to an end. The interpretation suggested seems to accord with the chief act of creation that was performed in the island of trampling, the making of the earth. It is therefore evident that this activity might require the symbols representing the original creative powers. From this point of view, the scene in which the image of the arm was invoked before the new period of creation of the earth started becomes clear. Further confirmation can be seen in the nature of the new phase of the creation. As has already been said above, this process of creation is described in our texts by the expression SWIHT T squiggly and appears and appears in its essential nature to be unlike the properly organic mode of creation from which the island had resulted. We attempted to explain in one of our previous studies the significance of the action described as to endue with power the substances of the earth, which is that SWIHT T squiggly. It appeared as though this enduing with power the substance of the earth action had the aspect of a symbolic and magical rite of creation. The main part of that rite consisted of uttering sacred spells by the creators over certain IHT-T squiggly, which we may say might have been believed to symbolize the earth to be created. We suspect that by virtue of this rite, it was believed that the symbols IHT of the earth were filled with social power or special power. This power then caused the earth to emerge in the form of specific plots of earth along and around the edges of the island. This procession of creation of the earth by the word of the creators has no equivalent. Such a manner of creation can be compared with the Hermopolitan conception of the creation of the world. According to the latter, the earth was believed to have been created by drying up the primeval waters that surrounded the island. Both of these ways of creating, the magical process as well as the procedure by the solar radiance, had the same result. They seem to have made manifest what was created previously by the nameless powers, but was hidden beneath the primeval waters. The Edfu accounts set out clearly that, according to the Egyptians, the earth was not believed to have been created in a single action. On the contrary, there seem to have been two distinct periods of creation. At first, the substance was created by a properly organic and physical act. Then, in the second period, the already existing substance was brought by a further action to the surface of the primeval waters. The nature of the creative activity completed during the second period seems to vary according to the places in which the myth of creation was either elaborated or adopted and adapted. Description of the creation of the earth as completed in the second period may explain why in the majority of the Egyptian cosmogonical texts the origin of the earth is described only as an emergence of the earth from the water. The creation of the earth performed in the island of Trampling was therefore interpreted as being essentially symbolical in nature. This fact might help to explain the idea that the earlier creating powers were believed to be present as symbols only. Since the creation of the primary matter was completed, their presence appears to have been required only with a view to effecting the second phase of the creation of the earth. Moreover, The process of creation executed in this island seems to apply the origin of lands of a special nature. As will be seen below, the lands created from the islands of trampling were sites needed for the foundation of sacred places which came to be the earliest sacred domains of the god, in which enclosures of the gods were set up, and in which temples were built later on. It thus appears as though in the speculative theory implicit in our Edfu texts, we have much explicit evidence of the idea of the foundation ground existing before the origin of the world. We can conclude that the part played by the island of trampling in the drama of creation was that of a veritable foundation. This may explain why the subsidiary name of the island was that of the foundation ground, or SNTT, of the ruler of the wing. This proves that the island of the egg and the island of trampling were equal in respect of their primary function in the creation. Dude, it's interesting stuff. The close affinities between these two islands can also be proved by the essential features of their configuration. They show a striking resemblance, so that it can justly be claimed that the description of these two islands, as they are known to us from the Edfu texts, was inspired by the same doctrinal ideas. The second myth, however, shows slightly modified views, which, as might have resulted from the traditions of the place in which this second myth was written down first. Another point of similarity with the island of the egg can be found in the mention of the primeval mound. We know from the myth about the island of the egg that there was created, in a secondary act, a mound, the Kai, or high hill, where the subsidiary phases of creation took place. The Edfu Island has also a primeval mound called High Were, which is high, and it's like a backwards larger wait, it's like a tiny parentheses facing the wrong way. Comma, or is wait, comma is when it's below. What's it called when it's above? Why can't I remember that right now? A semicolon? No. And balls, that's annoying. The Kai, or high heel, or high hill. I thought maybe someone said it. Where the subsidiary phases of creation took place. The Edfu Island has also a primeval mound called High Were. Our creation story makes it clear that in its origin, this mound was a secondary terrestrial configuration, and that it was also created by virtue of the Word. The island of Trampling, too, seems to have been the homeland of the primeval deities. There is clear evidence of a belief that the island was occupied by some divine beings prior to the time of the creation of lands with which our cosmogonical theory is concerned. The divine beings of the island of Trampling, however, seem to be deities of a nature entirely different from the divine inhabitants of the island of the egg. In place of the capital KAS, or cause, we find allusion here to a rather obscure company of divine beings described as D squiggly JSW. The text does not preserve a description of their nature, and we do not even know to whom the word company might refer. D squiggly JSW may have been the name of some divine beings who eventually formed the company of the nameless god described as PN, or this one. This deity, to whom we have already referred, is another divine being peculiar to the myth. The text neither interprets his origin nor describes his appearance. His epithet, the overlord of the pillar, indicates that he might well have been the ruler of the island of Trampling, or at least have governed the field of reed. We imagine this god, therefore, as resting on the DD pillar of reeds in the midst of the pool. Perhaps around his seat were assembled the other obscure deities mentioned on a single occasion in our narrative. The name PN, which is capital P and then N, Pn, Pn. The name PN as a divine name is known to us only from our main documents and from some additional inscriptions at Edfu, from which we can deduce that this PN god was imagined as resembling the falcon, which is DRTY falcon, and that he was regarded indeed as the creator. If our interpretation of the island of the egg be correct, this PN god resting on the DD pillar of reed would appear on a par with the sun god on the lotus. In an inscription of the temple at Karnak, we find that a god represented residing in the lotus is described as the PN god. Unlike the myth about the island of the egg, in this myth, the PN god is never said to have acted, but the text acquaints us with his Ba and Ka, which is just Ka, and Ba, who appeared on the scene when the new period of creation started and then played a prominent part. Furthermore, apart from the obscure company of divine beings, this PN god seems to have had yet two other fellows. We read in the narrative about a deity described as the HTR-HR, and yet another falcon named NFR-HR, who bears two subsidiary names as the Sanctified Ruler and the Ruler of the Wing. The name HTR-HR is known, in the main, as the name of the sacred spear of Horus, but this can hardly be so in our myth. In the account of the situation in the island of Trampling, this HTR-HR is described as a divine being who also dwelt on a DD pillar of reed. This suggests that he might have been in the same place as the PN god, and that he eventually might have ruled in the primeval island. This hypothesis is admissible because, in the tradition of a somewhat later date, the island of Trampling is described as the Great Mound of the Heter-Her, which is HETER-HER. It is possible that in the island, the Heter-Her functioned as the protector. So much is suggested by the account of the creation of a new sacred domain. And this idea can be confirmed by the tradition of a later date. The Heter-Her is interpreted as a deity who repulses the evildoer from the mansion of the god. The significance of the name HTR-HR, however, remains unsolved, and very little is known of his physical appearance. The text tells us only that he was conceived to be an armless deity. Interesting. Hey, Bhavana Baral. Welcome in. Good to see you. Good to meet you. The name of the second fellow of the PN god, the NFR-HR, is not unfamiliar as a divine name. It occurs frequently as a subsidiary. Am I saying that right? Yeah, subsidiary name of Ta, which is capital P and then TAH. It is certain, however, that in our mythological story, this name does not apply to Ta himself, but to another deity who is said to be the ruler of the wing, who revealed himself in the island as the protection of the DD pillar, and on whom the tradition of the later date looked as and on whom the tradition of a later date looked as on a great god. Oh, looked as on a great god. Looked on as? No, it's I said it right the first time. Does it mean the same thing? And on whom the tradition of a later date looked as on the great god. These facts seem to hint at a tradition which connected the very spot of creation, in this myth the field of reeds, with the realm of the falcons, which was believed to have existed in the primeval age. That the Egyptians believed that deities resembled falcons took part in the drama of creation is already known from the text that accompanies the scene of adoration of the sages at the Edfu temple, and which we have discussed above. We also pointed to the tradition concerning the Waret, the primeval region in which the sages were believed to have been born, and to which allusion is made by another ritual scene to be found among the inscriptions of the Chapel of Re at Edfu. The text tells us that in the Waret, the sages assumed the form of falcons, and from their native Waret, they foretold the creation of the world. There is much that is similar in these accounts. Both furnish us with a clear illusion that some divine beings resembling the falcons were believed to be the creators of the earth and lived in the island of creation. We suspect that the pool of reeds in our main record and the Waret in the second tradition may be the same primeval region. If this suggestion be accepted, the main source will permit us to gain a fairly clear idea of this primeval Waret in which the sacred falcons were believed to live at first. It would follow that this Waret was imagined as a field of reeds which enshrined a small group of supports. These supports were made, in all probability, from the stalks of reed which were tied up together to form the resting place of the bird. The tradition regarded it as the earliest form of the DD pillar. It may very tentatively be suggested that the beginning of the first cosmogonical record preserves the memory of one of the earliest Egyptian places of worship that were constituted in an open field. The description of the Waret gives a clear idea of a primitive enclosure in which the falcons were reared in the dim past of prehistoric Egypt and which had for its center the DD pillar of reed. Okay, I see where I am. Mm. Mm. The high date of the domain of the DD pillar might have resulted in the realm of the falcons being associated with the idea of the dwelling place of the creator. Here, therefore, in an entirely different context, we have unambiguous evidence that the birthplace of some divine beings was conceived as the first sacred place in which the primeval deities lived and founded their resting place. Apparently, the ideas already known from the myth about the island of the egg underlie also the conception of the nature of the first sacred place in the tradition we are outlining, the birthplace of the gods, assuming the function of their first cultist place. If our equation be correct, it would appear that the primeval domain of the DD pillar or DD pillars would be equivalent in its significance to the Hermopolitan pool enshrining the lotus. The picture of the sacred domain of the primeval age will provide further evidence to support the hypothesis that the Egyptians definitely imagined the spot of creation as a genuine, though very primitive, cultist place of the creator. In the myth about the island of trampling, there is mentioned yet another deity who lived in the vicinity of the realm of the falcon. This one is said to be the Earthmaker, which is IR-T squiggly. It's like, and the squiggly is like a, man, I don't know. Sometimes my interwebs have been real in and out. Let's see. Where is it so I can show you? Okay. So Earthmaker. This, it's like a 3, but it's like higher up. This squiggly. Try to get up in there. And there's one over here too. There's another squiggly. These squigglies are all over the place. I wonder what they are. Another language. So this one is said to be the Earthmaker, who was believed to have dwelt in the field of reeds in the company of some other deities. These were two creators of the waters, whose names were the Divine of Heart and the creator of the primeval water. I love that. Then two protecting deities whose names were Shumher and I'm just pronouncing these words. I don't know. It's SHM-HR and excuse me, P squiggly dash SGMH, whose names were Shimmer, and Ps, 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 Psgm. I don't know. I wonder if the squiggly like denotes some sort of like vowel sound, like in Hebrew or something. Or, anyways, the physical appearance of all these divine beings is never described in our sources, and their names are very rare as names of gods. In fact, they are known to us only from this narrative. Nevertheless, in this myth, they represent a group of deities who seem to be closely associated with the creator of the earth. Since the Earthmaker is said to have lived in the place where another creative power was present, it may be surmised that the Edfu account refers to a somewhat modified version of the original myth of creation. Consequently, the Earthmaker and his fellows are substituted for the second divine generation of gods who are believed to have lived in the island of the egg. There are definite points of contact in the description of the sacred domain in the island of the egg and the account of the sacred spot. There is, too, on the other hand, a striking resemblance to the domain of the pillars. The Earthmaker would appear, therefore, in an equal position with the PN god. Further resemblance can be noticed in their companions, as the PN god appears to be associated with the divine beings described as the HTR-HR. The Earthmaker seems to be connected with the divine of heart. At this point, too, our document reveals a new fact. Certainly, this companion of the Earthmaker is not the same god as the divine of the divine heart of Re, who is Thoth. No adequate picture is given of this divine of heart in our narrative. It is highly probable that he was one of the original inhabitants of the island of Trampling, and that he was connected with the creators of the earth, the Shebtu. The Edfu narrative tells us also that the divine of heart created the water, or the MW water. It is not stated how he did, nor is he said to have interfered in the creation after the Shebtu appeared on the scene. This divine of heart is also mentioned in connection with the Payland of Jeba. There, too, he does not appear as an acting divine power, since evidence is that this available divine of heart was associated with the ghosts of the island of Trampling. He was probably conceived as an intangible deity and was regarded as an ancestor god whose role was essentially symbolic when the new phase of creation dawned. Consequently, he may have been regarded as one of the original dwellers in the island of creation. The group of deities associated with the earth god is, on the whole, new, and certainly these creators are of an older, different, or rather, it's a different word. I'm going to start that paragraph again. The group of deities associated with the earth god is, on the whole, new, and certainly these creators are of an order different from the original creative powers whom we know from the myth about the island of the egg. All of them are described in the Edfu account as intangible deities, but it is evident that they all had their resting place in the field of reeds. We suspect that there is preserved the account of yet another early sacred domain of remote age, and that perhaps the Edfu account alludes to the place in which the earth god was duly worshipped in prehistoric Egypt. We can reconstruct, with a reasonable degree of probability, a coherent picture of the sacred place in which the creators of the primary matter, water and earth, were believed to have been first adored. This sacred domain will then be the third sacred place in the history of the Egyptian sacred domains, of which it was believed that they had existed in the primeval age. This primeval sacred domain seems to have existed on the ground in which the symbols of the creating powers were believed to have been hidden. We are told that it was there that the IR-T, or the Earthmaker, had lived with his companions. Our narrative does not preserve a picture of the Earthmaker himself. He is, in fact, only mentioned in the text. On the other hand, however, the description of the Earthmaker's domain is detailed. It seems that it resembled a primitive sacred domain which was fashioned from some light materials. A shelter is referred to in the description. Its function seems to have been to shield the symbols of the progenitor. In its surroundings, perhaps encircling the shelter, stood an enclosure which our text describes as the HWT-ISDN, the Mansion of Isden. ISDN. ISDEN. This mansion appears to be the Earthmaker's dwelling place, and perhaps the four other deities who seem to have played the role of his fellows in this drama of creation rested there. The text does not tell us what the real resting seat of the Earthmaker and his fellows within this mansion was, but describes several sacred emblems which seem to have been kept in the mansion, and which are said to have been the emblems of the Earthmaker himself. These are his mace, described as the HD-WR, the Great White, the DD pillar, and the image of the front of the god. So his image is described as the Great White. There's the DD pillar and the image of the front of the god. This tradition is completely unknown elsewhere, but we do not doubt that it preserves a detailed picture of a constructed, though primitive, sacred place of a type of the later enclosures described as HWT or mansion, and that this tradition reveals an entirely different conception of the nature and appearance of a sacred place in which the earth god was believed to live. The primeval resting place of the Earthmaker seems to have been imagined as a square structure fashioned from reeds. This was a properly fashioned enclosure. Perhaps this enclosure was erected on the edges of the pool of creation, encircling and protecting it because it might be surmised it was believed that the concrete shape of the elementary creating powers was concealed in the pool. Perhaps at a somewhat advanced stage, another light structure, having the form of a mere shelter, was made within this HWT enclosure to protect the symbols of the elementary creative powers and thus to mark the most sacred part of the ground of the enclosure. In the midst of the courtyard, there might eventually have been the DD pillar, which perhaps was the resting place of the Earthmaker, and was protected by the two other symbols, the Great White and the image of the front of the god. This is inevitably a hypothesis for which no parallel can, at present, be quoted. Nevertheless, we may hazard a guess at around this presumed seat of the earth god, there were assembled the four other creators, and probably these were believed to have acted at his command. It is true that we cannot claim that the earth god was exactly the first deity who seems to be glitching. I wonder if the sound was at least recorded. That's the most important part. Nevertheless, we may hazard a guess that around this presumed seat of the earth god, there were assembled the four other creators, and probably these were believed to have acted at his command. It is true that we cannot claim that the earth god was exactly the first deity who ever had a place of worship of such an appearance as is described in our Edfu sources. No single piece of archaeological evidence can be cited to reveal the appearance of the early sacred places in which the earth god might have been adored. Moreover, no memory is preserved of an early sacred domain bearing the name HWT-ISDN, which was what? Isden. Wait, what was that? What did that mean, though? The Mansion of Isden. That's what that means. domain bearing the name Mansion of Isden. Is that what I just said? I hope. Oh, this thing's kind of shining in my eyes. There we go. Okay. Oh, but now it's not bright enough. Okay, let's try again. But the way in which this primitive enclosure is pictured at Edfu does not appear to us unnatural. It shows logical features of organization which may well be those of the early sacred domains constructed from reeds. We incline to the opinion that the Edfu account once again gives a clear idea of the characteristics of a primitive enclosure as well as of its inhabitants, as it might once have existed in pre-dynastic Egypt. We think that we meet here exactly the same situation as is already known from the two other accounts concerning the place in which the Creator was believed to have first dwelt, or to dwelt first. As far as the myth is concerned, the fact which is of real interest is that the divine inhabitants of the island of Trampling too are described as having founded their cultist places in it before the rest of the world was created, which is so interesting. Compared with the Hermopolitan evidence, the idea of the cultist place within the island of creation is undoubtedly more prominent in the Edfu myth. For the purpose of our study, however, it is significant that the earliest known allusion to a HWT mansion occurs in connection with the creator of the earth, and that there are definite hints of a belief that the HWT mansion was the dwelling place of the earth god himself in the first period of existence of the original island. Moreover, this cultist place of the creator contains sacred symbols which are said to have been stored within the mansion of Isden. It is therefore most likely that this primeval mansion was conceived as a real place of worship. The situation in the mansion of Isden shows, on the other hand, one feature similar to that in the two preceding accounts. The earth god does not seem to have lived alone in his primeval enclosure, but it is highly probable that he was believed to have lived there in the company of other creative powers. We had in the first myth the sun god, with the P squiggly WTYW, the primeval ones. I'm glad they said that. I was thinking, I think I can pull this out of my brain. I'm glad they just supplied it to me. So we had in the first myth the sun god with the primeval ones. In the field of reeds, the falcons associated with the PN god. Finally, in the first HTW mansion, the earth god with other creators of the primary matter, prima materia. The two accounts disclosed by the first Edfu cosmogonical record are valuable pieces of evidence, and their detail adds a great deal to the Egyptian conception of the homeland of the primeval ones. These views are, at present, found expressed only in the inscriptions of the temple at Edfu. This fact does not necessarily mean, however, that the Edfu inscriptions reveal only a tradition which would solely apply to the site of the Edfu temple or to another sacred place in Upper Egypt. These three accounts are probably a part of a much wider, perhaps even of a general theory concerning the primary appearance of the mythical world in which the Egyptian gods were believed to have come into existence, to have lived, and to have created their own sacred domains. It is inherently possible that at Edfu, we find a hitherto unknown but certainly a genuine tradition which has its roots in facts, experiences, and beliefs which lead us far beyond the limits of historical times, since these two sacred domains of the primeval age are said to have existed before the first sacred place that survived in historical times was created. The three accounts of the Creator's domain have apparently a common ideological background, but differences can be noticed when we examine their physical details. Unlike the Hermopolitan tradition, according to which this homeland was merely a pool containing the lotus, the seat of the creator, around which were assembled the creative powers, The description preserved in the first cosmogonical record shows a somewhat more developed and advanced stage of the primitive resting place of the Creator and his fellows. It hints also at a somewhat more elaborated conception of the primitive sacred domains. The Hermopolitan primeval domain in the island of creation is in essence a natural outcome of the elementary phases of creation. In contrast, the two domains described as having existed in the island of trampling contains elements which were fashioned. Yet the DD pillar of the PN god must have been tied up from the stalks of the reeds, and the HTW or enclosure of the earthmaker with its shelter, which is an HT, must have been constructed. The account preserved does not permit us to discern who was the power who might have created these resting places. Hence, what can be suggested, with all due reserve, is that the first divine beings to occupy the island of trampling during its first period were believed to have created them themselves after they settled on the first piece of solid land. In the last account of the Creator's sacred domain, which we have been analyzing, the primitive mansion, or HWT, with its shelter, NHT, is paralleled by the sacred place represented by the lotus pool and the field of reeds containing the DD pillar. We are of the opinion that this account preserves the memory of a primitive cultist place which once existed. It follows that the origin and the existence of the first mansion, the first properly constructed enclosure, the most basic feature of the complete house of the god of later historical times, was included in the first period of the existence of the primeval island and was linked with the process of the creation of the earth. This point, undoubtedly, is of prime importance. It follows that the HWT mansion was not only the dwelling place of the earth god, it was also the result of his creative activities. It seems to us most likely that in the speculation implicit in the Edfu records, the act of fashioning a resting place of the god came to be regarded as part of the process of the creation of the earth. It formed only a part of all the acts of creation which were believed to have taken place within the island during its first period. It seems to be the final act that had happened in the island. We imagine that the Egyptians believed that after the first phases of creation in general were completed, the creators fashioned for themselves their resting places in the very place where the existence of the world started, and thereby they fulfilled the first phase of the creation of substances. Man, is anybody getting Hollow Earth vibes here? Or like as above, so below? Juicy. The mythological situation pictured in the first Edfu cosmogonical record seems to have produced yet another interesting fact. If we admit that in describing the creation of the earth, the texts record the stages of evolution of the Egyptian sacred places, it is evident that the Egyptian tradition was that the earliest cultist places were founded near, or even enshrined, the piece of the earth in which the symbols of the creative powers were believed to have been concealed. This is a valuable piece of evidence which will show that the connection between the creation and the origin of the sacred place was most probably a tradition of remote date. A further deduction that can be made is that a further deduction that can be made is that in Egypt, the earliest cultist places were founded exclusively for the worship of the creator and the natural creative forces. The fact that the first Edfu cosmogonical record preserves, on the one hand, the account of the primeval realm and the sacred falcons, and on the other hand, that of the creator of the earth, is significant enough to suggest where these traditions may have been at home. We imagine that in this part of Egypt, these traditions and beliefs were made into a myth of creation which became familiar to other religious centers of pre-dynastic or proto-dynastic Egypt. Another fact peculiar to this tradition is that the deities residing in these domains bear specific names. The tradition may point to a somewhat later stage of the. Oh, I lost my spot. That fly really sidetracked me. The tradition may point to a somewhat later stage of the mythical age, when the worship of nameless creative powers was followed by a period in which, near the original sacred spot, the mere advanced type of sacred places developed. Or no, not mere, more. Let me try that sentence again. The tradition may point to a somewhat later stage of the mythical age, when the worship of nameless creative powers was followed by a period in which, near the original sacred spot, the more advanced type of sacred places developed. If we recall that the PN god appears to be on a par with the sun god, it is evident that the first Edfu cosmogonical record discloses the tradition of an early cultist place which adopted the original belief to its local needs. It seems definitely to reflect the final stage of the development of the homeland of the primeval ones, which is here the sacred domain of the DD pillars, where the DRTY, the sacred falcons of the primeval age, were believed to have rested. In what follows, our documents seems to point. Oh wait, in what follows, our documents seem to point out to the times when Egyptians began to associate the original nameless powers with animate beings. It should be recalled that in our creation story, the principal deity, though he is a physical personality conceived as a bird, is still nameless and is described only as the PN god, or this one. His fellows then bear specific names, but all these names contain the component HR, face, or countenance. It looks as though the tradition implicit in the Edfu record alludes to the time when Egyptian belief gave importance to the countenance of the being in which the divine power was believed to dwell. Easy for me to say. Similar features can be seen in the tradition of the third primitive domain. There is also a deity whose name contains the element HR. The names of the other deities appear to be derived from their creative activities. Thus, the earth god is described as the IR-T squiggly, the creator of waters as the PTH-NWYT. These two names characterize the creative activities which these two divine powers were believed to have completed, and from which resulted the land where they founded their resting place. It appears that at that stage of the belief, there seems to have been a need to mark out in a somewhat more prominent way the place where the concrete likeness of the divine powers was believed to dwell. Supports were fashioned for them from light material, and finally fences were erected around their private realm. The views expressed in the Edfu accounts, therefore, render it highly probable that the belief in the creator's private domain was of general application. They demonstrate that this belief must have been familiar to several cultist places of prehistoric times, and that, consequently, it is likely that the creator's cultist places were among the first that were founded. As far as our instances go, this tradition applies to the cult of the sun god, as well as to that of the earth god. The ideological background that can be discerned in the descriptions of the three domains of the creator confirms that there was originally a single myth about this primeval domain. This myth seems to have been taken over by many other religious centers of the early historic Egypt, each of them bringing such modifications as might have been dictated by local beliefs and traditions. The mythological situation in the island of Trampling can be considered as a proof of what we have tentatively suggested, that each of the principal religious centers of Egypt claimed for itself the honor of being the first sacred place in which the Creator dwelt with his fellows before he had created the world. The existence of the domain of the Creator is interpreted as forming a definite era in the creation of the world. It has, too, a vital significance in the history of the Egyptian temple, as will be seen below. A further consequence is that the idea inherent in this creation story is that only from the homeland of the primeval ones could the domains of the gods of historical times have been created. The existence of a small and primitive sacred place on the edges of the island of creation at the dawn of this world appears to be the prerequisite of their coming into existence. A study of the myth concerning the origin of the Temple of the Falcon will justify this statement. It seems to indicate that the origin of the genuine sacred places of the Falcon was directly linked with the domain of the Creator. It is, however, evident that the creation of the lands for the new sacred domains did not proceed from the domain of the Creator in a direct and continued line. Between the time when the sacred world of the Creator and his primeval fellows exited within the island of creation. No, not exited, existed. That's different. Okay, so let's try again. This is the last sentence of this chapter. Between the time when the sacred world of the Creator and his primeval fellows existed within the island of creation, and the time when it was believed that the lands for the domains of other gods began to be created, there was a long period of darkness. Juicy. All right. I'm going to pause just for a moment. I'm going to do a little cough, get some drink, and then I'm going to be back for the next chapter. It's just going to be like less than a minute. I'll be right back. Oh, whoa. Wrong button. Okie doke. Hey, Pa Joe, welcome in. Good to see ya. Yeah, it's almost spring here too. I love it. The birds have been chirping here too. It's so nice. But we're supposed to get snow again next week. So, I mean, it really still is winter. I mean, sometimes you get snow in spring anyways, right? But man, there's like buds on the trees outside my window and everything. It's so nice. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that took an hour. All right. Very good. Chapter 8. The decay and resurrection of the primeval island. Nothing is known about what happened to the island of the egg after the sun god was born, and after the world in general was brought into existence. None of the texts deriving from the Hermopolitan doctrine affords an explanation of the eventual fate of the original island of creation. Nowhere is there any account to tell us of the gradual growth of the seat of the sun god within the pool of the island. Nevertheless, at Edfu, there are a number of data that enable us to reconstruct the consecutive periods as well as to trace the fate of the homeland of the primeval ones. Excuse me. After they founded their resting places in it, and after life developed within the island. Although these data seem to apply to the island of trampling in the first place, yet their significance implies that the Edfu records yield views of general application. Certainly, it will be wrong to think that the story about the fate of the island of creation was only a local Edfu tradition. As has briefly been mentioned above, it is noteworthy that the beginning of the first Edfu cosmogonical record refers neither to the origin nor to a previous existence of this island, such as can be discerned in the texts of the Offering of the Lotus. The first picture recorded appears rather to allude to a primeval world which already existed, and which was in darkness. This situation provides a reasonable ground for theorizing. It may be surmised that the first era known by our principal sources was a period which started from what existed in the past. The general tone of the beginning of the first record seems to convey the view that an ancient world, after having been constituted, was destroyed, and as a dead world, it came to be the basis of a new period of creation, which at first was the recreation and resurrection of what of what once had existed in the past. There are hints of another mythical world of which the island seems to have been a survival. I wonder if you can hear the birds singing out my window right now. In the preceding chapter, we discussed the allusions to the other mythical world, and we attempted to outline its features. It was believed that two sacred domains were constituted within the island of Trampling during the first period of its existence, one of them being the domain of the creator of the earth, the other that of the PN god and his fellows, who rested on the deity pillars. If our reconstruction be accepted, it would follow that the domain of the creator was destroyed. This hypothesis receives some support at first from the fact that the island is said to have been in darkness before the creators of the lands for the sacred domains, the Shebtu, were introduced into it. Another argument can be seen. My screen went black again. I wonder, should I start that paragraph again? This hypothesis receives some support at first from the fact that the island is said to have been in darkness before the creators of the lands for sacred domains, the Shebtu, were introduced into it. Another argument can be seen in the significance of the names which the island was given in our creation story. The name Island of Trampling itself suggests that when the first phases of creation had been completed, and the primeval Lord of all was resting on his primeval seat, such as the lotus or the pillar of reeds, life developed within the island. This then became the scene of various mythical events, such as, for instance, the Titi, which is Titi. Theoretically, Titi can be interpreted as trampling or aggression. It may, therefore, be surmised that there was a fight in the island. The exact nature of this fight is difficult to explain. That a time of combat was indeed connected with the early history of the island is quite clear when we refer to the subsidiary names of the island. Island of the Combat and Island of the Peace appear to reflect the same situation. These names might hint at the main mythical events which were believed to have come to pass in the island after the domain of the creator of the earth and the PN god were constituted. Both of these domains might have been assailed by an enemy, and this might have led to a fight between the original inhabitants and the enemy. The result was that both of the early domains were destroyed, and that the sound I fell. Sound I was capitalized. Interesting. This event is, in fact, the mythological picture with which the Edfu text begins. The mention of the sound I in this creation story appears a little strange. The function of the sound I is, in fact, not clear here, for it is never referred to in the ensuing narrative, except for one rather vague reference to the light. This myth of creation never mentions any astral body, nor alludes to the sun disk. The WD squiggly T, or sound I, might in this tradition have been the name of the center of the light which illuminated the island. Interesting. This is, however, somewhat hypothetical. All that can be said with due reserve is that it looks as though there is an allusion to a disaster which caused the fall of the sound I. Sound. Oops. Oh, that wasn't the end of the sentence. All that can be said with due reserve is that it looks as though there is an allusion to a disaster which caused the fall of the sound I, with the result that complete darkness fell on the sacred domain of the creator. In this darkness, the island was found when a new period of creation dawned. The view that it was in fight, or the view that it was a fight that brought the first sacred domain of the Creator to an end can furthermore be supported by the evidence of the name which the primeval water surrounded the island of creation is given in this context. It has been said that at the beginning of chapter 5, that in this myth, the primeval water from which the earth was believed to have emerged bears the name HBBT. In the opening words of this narrative, however, the HBBT, primeval water, is given the name Wort, or W, RT, or W parenthesis RT, Wort. We do not think that Wort has, in this context, the same meaning as is known from the tradition about the primeval falcon-like deities, the sages. In this tradition, WRT seems to describe the pool in which the falcons were born. This interpretation indeed appears to be unlikely here. In contrast, the occurrence of the word WRT in the first Edfu record may hint at a rather gloomy situation that might surround the island. Eventually, it might hint at the probable fate of the island. WRT might describe the water lying on the primeval world after this was brought to an end. In support of this view, we can refer to another and well-known mythological event. In the Osiris myth, WRT was the name of the part of Noon in which the dead body of the god was found and in which his grave was. Using this evidence, one is tempted to imagine that a closely similar situation was believed to have existed in the history of the island of trampling, and that this is the very beginning of the period of the island known from the main Edfu record. The primeval water might have submerged the island as a consequence of a fight, and the island become the tomb of the original divine inhabitants. Thus, the HBBT water became the WRT water. That it might have been interpreted in this way is highly probable. The beginning of the first Edfu record does not tell us that the new generation of creators arriving in the island would perceive the island itself when the sun shone once more on the primeval waters. It is stated that they saw only the reeds on the surface of the water. The mythological situation we attempted to outline appears admissible in view of the fact that in the first record there are, indeed, frequent allusions to the death of the first creation. It is, in fact, its general tone. It should be recalled once again that one of the subsidiary names of the island is the Island of Combat, a name which shows a link with the title of a mythological narrative which was incorporated in the text of the first record. This title reads, "The Place of Uniting of the Company Which Passed By." There is much that is uncertain in the interpretation of this expression, for no parallel can be quoted, and the text gives no further information in this respect. The use of the verb SNI in this context suggests that this company of divine beings was, perhaps, believed to have perished. If we accept this explanation, it would appear that the original divine inhabitants of the island, the presumed company of the PN god, while fighting against the enemy, were killed. If this surmise be correct, there may be a link with the idea that the island might become the tomb of its own inhabitants. Indeed, in this connection, reference should be made. Indeed, in this connection, reference should be made to a mythical place which is described in this tradition as the DW squiggly T N capital B squiggly, or the underworld of the soul. The existence of an underworld in the vicinity of an island of creation is most significant for the study of the ideas that underlie this creation story. Since we can quote evidence that Osiris was believed to have been preeminent in the underworld of the soul, and that he is the HTPY, the preeminent in the underworld of the soul, who partakes of the meal It is evident that there is a clear allusion to the burial place, which was possibly, it may be suggested, that of the earth god. The Edfu inscriptions preserve the memory of a belief that the earth god, the Masenti, who brought everything into existence and who formed the earth, has his Ba. This Ba of the Masenti then is the preeminent in the underworld of the soul. The mummy. That's where I heard that word, Masenti. I think like Dwayne Johnson says it. Anyways, these quotations, though brief, are of real interest. They seem to allude to the belief that the chthonic deity, which is Chthonic, we got to look it up. Chthonic? I have no idea how to say that. Okay. Squiggle, glamour, glamour. Okay. Masenti. Shoot. CHTH. Where are you at? CHTHONIC. Okay. Definition and pronunciation. Chthonic. Concerning, belonging to, or inhabiting the underworld. Ooh. Chthonic. Juicy. I wonder why it's spelled. What's the etymology here? Why is it spelled that way? Chthonic. Chthonic. Might seem a lofty and learned word, but it's actually pretty down to earth in its origin and meaning. It comes from CHTHON, so thon, maybe, which means earth in Greek. Okay, cool. And it is associated with things that dwell in or under the earth. It is most commonly used in discussions of mythology, particularly underworld mythology, which is what we're talking about. All right, cool. Latinized form of Greek. Chthonic. Cool. Okay, back to StreamYard. They seem to allude to the belief that a chthonic deity was the first deceased god in Egyptian mythology. They, too, disclose the belief in the soul of the earth god. The soul who appears in the Edfu myth about the time when the first sacred domain was revivified might have been the very soul of the deceased earth god. This soul was related to the Pian god, and if our conjecture be accepted, it would follow that the Pian god too might primarily have been an earth god. This is not explicitly stated in our text, but we know that this Pian god was regarded as being the DRTY falcon, and this brings to mind the myth about the sages, according to which the creators of the earth were imagined in the form of the DRTY falcons. This tradition is known to us only from the Edfu textual evidence. Further allusion to the death and decay of the first mythical world can be seen in the mention of the relic of the Pian god. As far as the description preserved permits us to reconstruct the situation, the name relic seems to apply to the reeds which grew on the marginal land of the island. In the first mythical world, reeds were used for making the resting places of the gods, specifically for the making up of the Didi pillar. Thus, the reeds used for such a purpose and remained in situ appear to have been regarded as the relic of the sacred domain that once existed there but had perished. Words such as waret and ite and relic and underworld of the soul suggest that closely connected with the island of creation, there was a place that had obvious funerary associations, a place which was conceived as the burial place of a deity who died, whose soul had flown into the sky, and whose material form remained in the same place. Balls with the connection, dude. One bar at say. Words such as waret and ait, relic, and underworld of the soul suggest that closely connected with the island of creation, there was a place that had obvious funerary associations, a place which was conceived as the burial place of a deity who died, whose soul, whose soul had flown to the sky, and whose material form remained in the same place. This Ka, who dwelt among the reeds of the island. The tradition of a god who was brought out of noon by a pre existing power, but who died thereafter, whose soul went to the sky, and for whose embodiment the underworld then was created, can be discerned in another text preserved at Edfu. In a description of the august god who came into being in the creator pool, and who is the sun god born in the lotus, we read that, quote, for his soul the sky was uplifted so that he may shrine therein, the underworld being mysterious to conceal his body, end quote. This short text seems to emphasize the Egyptian belief that the life of the creator, in this particular instance the solar deity, was limited. Although we have no evidence from the Hermopolitan texts that the sun god, after having created the world, was killed, it may be assumed with reference to our Edfu text that this belief was derived from a general doctrine. The death of the creator seems to have been regarded as the starting point of a new phase of creation, or a new period of existence. This view agrees with the Heliopolitan doctrine concerning the daily rebirth of the sun god. Referring to our Edfu myth, we can see definite points of contact with the fate of the Pian god. As has been said, the Pian god appears on a par with the sun god as regards his function in the first sacred domain of the island. That he was believed to have died is equally admissible, because the myth speaks of his Ba and Ka, who appear on the scene at the opening of the new era in the existence of the island, but they are never said to be tangible divine beings. To supplement this theory concerning the death of the first mythical world, it must be emphasized that the first cosmogonical record contains yet another allusion to the decay of a former state and describes its remains. A very brief mention is made in the second part of this first record of an entering in that which was in decay, which is in italics. Death of the first mythical world is also in italics. This sentence, entering in that which was in decay, linked with the description of the domain of the Earthmaker. We may hazard a guess that this sentence describes the state in which the new generation of gods arriving in the island found the enclosure of the Earthmaker and his fellows. It was reduced to debris. To explain the reasons for the death and the resurrection of the first sacred domain of the Earthmaker, several interpretations are possible. In referring to what has been said about the fate of the domain of the Pian god, it may be suggested that this was indeed the general Egyptian theory. The first sacred domain that ever existed was believed to have been limited in time, and its decay was merely the normal course of events. In the same way in which the domain of the DRTY falcons resting on the DD pillars had disappeared, the enclosure of the Earthmaker vanished. In support of this view, we can refer to another Edfu inscription revealing the belief that the lifespan of the first generation of gods, the primeval ones, was limited in time. After they completed their task in the creation of the world, they were believed to have been buried, and the other generation of gods came to their grave to perform the funerary rites on their behalf. This quotation concludes, all the previously mentioned allusions to the death of the first sacred world and appears only as a somewhat modified interpretation of the trends of thought that underlie our creation story. We suggest that the Edfu myth gives a somewhat more dramatic context for the general theory. There was perhaps a storm in which the first sacred domain, represented by the mansion of Isden, was thought to have perished. There are, in the same Edfu source, hints of a mythological situation that could only result from an aggression against the island of creation. This hypothesis receives some support from a clear allusion to the defeat of the Heater-Her. The description of the domain of the Earthmaker contains words of a god, which the Earth God seems to have told to his successor, his son, and who is in this myth the falcon. He seems to have described to him what had happened in the dwelling place of the Earth Maker. He refers to a snake, the NHP-WR, the Great Leaping One, who appears to be the chief enemy of the god. He explains that the arms of the enemy oppressed the head of the Heater-Her, who was defenseless. His feet were pierced, and the ground of the domain was split. This is a clear picture of a disaster. From the narrative preserved, it would appear as though the words of the Earth God yield the fate of the domain of the Earthmaker and what had happened in the domain of the DD Pillars. This description, though short, is explicit enough for us to reconstruct the Egyptian belief connected with the destiny of the homeland of the primeval ones. This sacred domain, having been constituted by the creators themselves, came to its end at a definite moment of the primeval age. A storm, perhaps, came over the island during which an attack was made by an enemy pictured as a snake. There is something looking interesting down here. It's the first one that I really felt like. Most of them are just references of pages and numbers, but this is actually some text down here. So where is that one at up in this? Oh, so the falcon, it says. So this sentence was words of a god, which the Earth God seems to have told to his successor, his son, and who is in this myth, the falcon. And it says, quote, the NHP-WR-snake has approached. The father spoke to the child. We suspect that this text alludes to what had happened after the enclosure of the Earth God was reconstructed. Perhaps there occurred then what had once happened during the first time period of the existence of this domain. When the god settled down, the enemy snake appeared on the scene. He reappeared once again after the enclosure was reconstructed and was ready for a new attack. Interesting. Hey, Mr. Hugh, good to see you, dude. Happy Saturday. So he explains that the arms of the enemy were oppressed by the head of the Heater-Her, who was defenseless. His feet were pierced, and the ground of the domain was split. This is a clear picture of a disaster. From the narrative preserved, it would appear as though the words of the Earth God yield the fate of the domain of the Earthmaker and what had happened in the domain of the DD Pillars. This description, though short, is explicit enough for us to reconstruct the Egyptian belief connected with the destiny of the homeland of the primeval ones. This sacred domain, having been constituted by the creators themselves, came to its end at a definite moment of the primeval age. A storm, perhaps, came over the island during which an attack was made by an enemy pictured as a snake. I guess I read all that, but it was interesting again. The aggression was so violent that it destroyed the sacred land, with the result that the divine inhabitants died. This interpretation accords with other parts of the first Edfu record, which alludes to the death of the company, D squiggly JSD, to which we have referred above, and to the darkness that covered the primeval island. There is substantial evidence to attest the theory concerning the death of the first sacred world in the mythological age in which the Earth God and the nameless deity ruled. The mythological situation which we attempted to outline shows points of contact with the myth of Osiris and fits in with the allusion to the fall of the sound eye, which seems to mark the beginning of the new era in the history of the island of trampling. On the other hand, this, this mythological situation once more recalls ideas included in the Heliopolitan doctrine. The primeval hill, why is it hard for me to say that word? The primeval hill at Heliopolis was the place of birth, but it was at the same time the place of death, which then became the place of rebirth. Probably our Edfu document discloses a somewhat earlier conception of this idea. In the Heliopolitan doctrine, the rebirth was manifested by the appearance of the soul of the sun god. Here, too, the soul of the creator was present in the island when the new phase of creation dawned. Its emergence would mean the rebirth and renewal of the island. This soul is in our creation story, the flying Ba. This flying soul thus returned to its original place, the fields of reeds in which the domain of the deity pillar was once created and then buried. A further important fact that emerges from the Edfu account is the allusion to the underworld. The Edfu narrative makes it clear that the underworld was believed to have existed before the world was created. It does not preserve a description of this underworld of the primeval age. It gives only its name, the underworld of the soul. Nevertheless, it seems to disclose an interesting view of the origin of the underworld. From the mythological situation described, we conjecture that the underworld of the primeval gods might have been conceived as a direct outcome of the existence of the first sacred domain, the cultus place of the creator. It was thought, perhaps, that the underworld resulted from the destruction of the cultus place of the creator of the earth, and that during the period of darkness, the underworld became the resting place of all the original inhabitants of the island of trampling. This underworld was regarded as a place concealed underneath the field of reeds in which the original deities arrived in their spiritual appearance and there found their new home. There is no authority to give further details. We can only add the common statements that the underworld was created by the creator at the same time as the water, earth, and sky. Our deduction from the Edfu account, however, may be supported by a number of allusions bearing on the revelation of the original dwellers of the island of trampling. We already know that the beginning of the first Edfu record alludes to the arrival of a divine being described as the Ka, K-A. The narrative suggests that he lived among the reeds and that there he had his own resting place, pictured as the deity pillar. As will be seen below, this divine being was the former ruler of the lands adjacent to the island. It is likely that this deity was regarded as the inanimate form of the nameless god, the PN god, and consequently the counterpart of the flying Ba. We can refer to an Edfu text which, though undoubtedly an interpretation of a later date, is significant as probably indicating the Egyptian view of the nature of this Ka. We are told that the Ka arrived in the capacity of the flying Ba. We know that the flying Ba was the spiritual likeness of the nameless god, and the text cited refers to their relationship. Hence, it is evident that there was a belief in the nameless deity who, after having died, could appear in the form of his Ba. A further implication of this belief is that this deity must have had his Ka. Since he does not bear any specific name, we may suppose that his posthumous forms bore names describing only their appearance. This Ka, as the likeness of the defunct PN god, was probably the Ka of the creator of the earth. Further support for this hypothesis may be seen in the fact that the Ka appeared in the island at the moment when the new period of creation of the earth dawned. We suspect that he was thought to have dwelt in the underworld during the period of darkness and to have emerged when the light shone once more on the island. Since we are told that he appeared on the scene after the reeds were removed, the underworld of the soul was probably believed to have been concealed underneath the field of reeds in which the domain of the DD pillars once existed. This Ka is said to be present in the island throughout the whole period of its development. It appears that a part of the work of the creation was effected at his command, but he is never described as a physically real divinity. This confirms that he was believed to have revealed himself from a place of funerary nature, and this statement seems to accord also with the belief of what we acquainted by an interpretation of a later date. It was believed that the voice of the Ka was heard, but that no man could see him. Following the Ka, yet another deity appeared on the scene, and seems to have come forth from the underworld of the soul. He is described as the sanctified ruler, who resembled the Nefer-Her. We already know this deity. The first Edfu record showed that this god most probably lived in the island during its first era and was believed to be a falcon and one of the companions of the Pian god. This god, though mentioned in the narrative, is never said to be a living god who would intervene in the process of the creation of the earth. We conclude that he was present only in his spiritual appearance, and this, perhaps, we may say, gave him a new function in the island. He was regarded as the protection of the Didi pillar. We know that the Didi pillar was the seat of the Pian god, and that this Didi pillar was regarded as the relic of the former domain when the new period of creation dawned. Therefore, the Nefer-Her revealed himself in the island in the capacity of the protector of the sole remainder of the former sacred domain of the Didi pillars. Further evidence of the same belief is afforded by the presence of the god called Hider-Her, or Heder-Her. The beginning of the first record makes it clear that Heder-Her was in the island before the creators landed in it. As will be seen below, Heder-Her was there throughout the whole period of development of the new world of the gods, but he is never said to have acted. Since it is known that Heder-Her was one of the former rulers of the island of Trampling, and the text does not say that he was a living god, it is possible that he too was conceived as an intangible divine being, and in his nature was equal to the Ka and Nefer-Her. Perhaps the Egyptians thought that there remained in the island, in the very place in which his resting place once stood, an image to which he returned in his spiritual appearance when once more the sun shone on the island. The way in which the appearance of the original inhabitants of the island at the commencement of the new sacred world is described, as well as the nature of the place from which they seem to have come, makes it likely that they were supposed to be in the island, or that they were supposed to be in the island in their original nature. There seems to have been present, or they seem to have been present not as deities acting in the creation, but as the ancestor gods. This would seem to be an argument in favor of the hypothesis concerning the origin of the underworld. It was created to house the creator of the earth, and his companions after their resting places in the island were destroyed. A further deduction that can be made is that the field of reeds assumed a new function when the second period in the existence of the island dawned. It became an ancestral territory. So much is suggested by the name which qualifies this field of reeds in which a new sacred domain was being created. The field of reeds that restores the ancestors. The fact that the land in which the creation was to be effected was at the same time a territory of the ancestors can be illustrated by a passage in the Karnak myth of creation. The place of the origin is the ground of the ancestors. The same tradition is known from the texts of the temple at Philae. Philae? The sanctified territory which Ta founded, and which men call the beginning of the earth, was at the same time a burial place in which Osiris was believed to rest. There are therefore solid reasons for supporting that the domain of the Didi pillars and the enclosure of the Earthmaker were regarded as ancestral lands when the new period of creation began. This would offer an undeniable argument in favor of the hypothesis that the first sacred world, the domain of the creator of the earth, was believed to have been brought to an end, and that from its decay, the underworld of the gods resulted. The name TPYW dash backwards parenthesis or ancestors can, in this tradition, only apply to the original divine dwellers of the field of reeds. There is a good deal of evidence from the Edfu inscriptions to demonstrate that the first generation of creators was regarded as the company of gods, the ancestors of the first occasion, as the ancestors who created the primeval ones and who brought into existence all that exists, and that the earth god, too, was believed to be the first among the ancestors. This brings to mind the situation in the island of the egg, which in our Edfu texts bears as a subsidiary name the fiery place of the ancestors. In addition, we find at Edfu a number of isolated instances which prove the theory concerning the place of the ancestors or the field of the ancestors. They tell us of the field of the DRTY falcons, the blessed territory of the primeval ones, a name which appears to be used in the Edfu geographical lists as synonymous with the district of the ghosts, which of the district of the DDW ghosts, which enshrines the reeds, and the field of the ancestors. Wow, I don't know why I feel so lightheaded reading this stuff. It's interesting. It's just like a natural high or something. That hit my nose. Okay. We cannot deny the logic of the theory implicit in the Edfu accounts, though it is the only source of its kind. It refers to the death from which results the rebirth, the resurrection of the island and of its inhabitants. The divine beings who were first to found the resting places in the island of creation are now the ancestors of the new world of gods. They too bear the name DDW ghosts. In their spiritual form, in which they came forth from the underworld of the soul, they seem to have attached the creation of the lands for new sacred domains, which were the continuation of their own cultist place. The idea of ancestry evidently governs the creation theory implicit in our Edfu documents. A new phase of creation began when once more the light shone on the primeval island and waters. It is to this precise moment, when a new period dawned, that it would seem that the beginning of the first Edfu record refers. Excuse me. Thus, it would refer to a renewal or revival of what had previously existed. And from this renewal, there developed a new period of creation which altered the original aspect of the island. There thus appears to be a strong reason for supporting, or rather, there thus appears to be a strong reason for supposing that our Edfu records are concerned, in the main, with the second phase in the existence of the island of creation. This picture of the beginning of the sacred world is unknown elsewhere. In the main, however, it makes allusion to a very common fact. The light brings new life to the world, which must have lain in darkness as a consequence of the aggression made by the enemy on the domain of the earth god. The record is silent about the causes or the power which dispelled the darkness and brought out the light again. It is only briefly stated that the primeval water grew radiant when the creator gods appeared on the scene. Oh, then, that was a full sentence. Then the creator gods appeared on the scene. These creators are two divine beings who are described as the companions of the divine heart, whose names were Wa and Ah. They were members of a divine family, which we know from the Edfu text only under the name Shebtu. The text does not indicate from where they had come. We are reduced to speculation. It is likely that they were among the original dwellers of the island who died. Also, the record does not provide a single hint that they might have been among the fellows of the Earthmaker in his primeval enclosure. On the other hand, however, there is at Edfu evidence of a tradition that these Shebtu were the second generation of the creators of the earth. They were, in fact, regarded as the offspring of the earth god. In a separate study devoted to this family of creators, we came to the conclusion that it was believed that these Shebtu were born in Noon, probably in a religion called Waret, from which they emerged to create this world. Our creation story makes it clear that the Shebtu were in no way connected with the creation of the original island, but that, on the contrary, their sole concern was the creative work during the second period of the creation of the earth, the time when the lands adjacent to the island were created. They were only deities who were believed to be able to complete the creation described as SW-IHT-T squiggly. From this point of view, it is clear that their creative work was not, by its nature, the organic process, but an action of metamorphic and magical order. Metamorphic. Our chief sources proceed to tell us that the Shebtu emerged from the water and were brought by an unnamed power to the edges of the island. They perceived the reeds and recognized the god Heder Her over and above them. There is also allusion to the god named Divine of Heart, who, however, does not seem to have acted at the time when the Shebtu emerged. The Shebtu were possibly within the Waret, and perhaps they were born during the period of darkness. When the light shone once more on the dead and silent island, they emerged on the surface of the waters. The appearance of the Shebtu, the creators of magical nature, on the ground of the dead world seems to be the first step towards the opening of a new period of creation. From the order of the accounts preserved in the first record, it is obvious that the new phase of the creation of the earth did not instantly follow the landing of the creators. In the first place, the Shebtu seem to have founded their own settlement on the marginal land of the island, which is described as the GS-W backwards a parenthesis RT. A parenthesis. Oops. Parenthesis. Well, I guess the parentheses goes both ways. And then if we have power, I'll show you what I mean when I keep talking about it. It's like a crescent moon almost. GS-W parenthesis RT. Although this name occurs only although this name occurs only once in our record, it is certain that GSWRT was believed to be a place name since it is provided with the determinative X. Wow, that's like an X that has a little circle around it. However, nothing has survived from which to reconstruct the Egyptian idea of the aspect of this place. But we can cite evidence of a tradition of a probably somewhat later date, which is known also from the Edfu sources only. Wa and Ah are described as the lords of the island of Trampling who established this place and who first lived there in the company of Re. Doubtless they were regarded as the first living deities who occupied the island of Trampling and who lived there close to the spot where the image of Heder Her stood. Around their home, however, the former world of the creator and the domain of the deity pillars was still dead. Their dwelling place appears in the tradition to be the center from which the new phase of creation, the resurrection of the first sacred world, was disseminated. The narrative proceeds to give a number of facts which make it possible to reconstruct the Egyptian views of the way in which Wa and Ah acted while revivifying the dead sacred world. In the development of events, the stage next to the foundation of a very primitive settlement of the creators on the marginal land of the island was an event described as the planting the perch. Some account of this mythological event has already been given in our separate study. It is, however, important to repeat the essential features of this event, which is unique of its kind. This event is doubtless, from the Egyptian point of view, vital in the development of the creation story, in particular, the revivification of the dead world and the origin of the new sacred domain which replaced it. It is stated in our record that after the Shebtu settled in their home, the reeds came floating by, then, quote, "The reed was split in two, and a half of it came to them. A slip of reed, which was in the primeval water, was planted, so that the winged one who marches around might perceive it. The name of the reed, which is in the primeval water, is Jeba, or perch. Protection was established. That which was made by the two divine beings, the Ka having arrived and the reed having been removed. The relic of this one, the DRTY falcon upon the DD pillar, is the reed that uplifts the god. The slip of reed is the name of the perch in Wecheset Neder. Thus, Jeba in Wecheset Neder became the name of this domain, great being the inundation in the fields that surround the marginal land of reeds." End quote. It is evident from this account that the perch was set up by Wa and Ah on the edge of the island of trampling, within the field of reeds, of which the principal function is defined by the expression "to uplift the god." It is inherently possible that the perch was erected in the same place as that in which the DD pillar of the PN god once stood, probably close to the DD pillar supporting Heter Her, and also near the place where the symbols of the creator were hidden. This tradition makes it clear that the perch is not the self-created seed of the god which emerged from noon, like, for example, the lotus, the seed of the first occasion of the sun god. The seed of the chief deity in our creation story, though in essence a slip of reed, was erected by the two creators of the earth and is, in fact, the first result of their creative capacity. The abbreviated versions of this myth help to fill out the picture of the planting of the Jeba perch, which is DJEBA-perch, Perch. It is explained that the falcon had arrived thereafter, alighted on the perch, and was uplifted by the reed. We attempted to explain in our previous study that in these statements there seems to be preserved some of the general Egyptian theory concerning the beginnings of the earliest sacred domain that survived in historical times. This idea receives some support from the fact that our document tells us that at that stage of the primeval age, the great inundation was still laying around the perch. The meanings which belief and tradition connected with this primeval perch are doubtless many and varied. If we recall that the reed was the sole relic of the former domain of the Pian god and his fellows, it is evident that only the reeds as such was believed to have contained the power of uplifting the god. The relic of the early domain was the only means through which the dead world might have been brought to its former state. The reed was the material from which the DD pillar was made, and as the relic of the first sacred world that vanished, provided the essential element for the creation of a new sacred domain that succeeded the former in a direct line. The essential idea implicit in the description of this event was undoubtedly the idea of the resurrection of the former world of the gods, and this idea can be emphasized by what followed thereafter. It is clearly stated that the reeds having been removed, the ka of the dead ruler arrived at the place of the perch. We may suggest that, by virtue of the action of removing the reeds and planting the slip on the marginal land of the island, the inanimate, uh, the, in, the inanimate the inanimate form of the dead ruler was reanimated and brought him out of the darkness to the very place where his former domain had once existed. It would appear that the erection of the perch was the vital act in this process, and this act made it possible for him and all the other deities of the early sacred domain to reveal themselves. All these actions occurred in a field which was sacred prior to the creation of the perch. And if we recall that in this creation, the Ka is said to be the first to come from the company of the divine ancestors, this circumstance, therefore, provides decisive evidence that only through the erection of the perch could the former sacred nature of that particular place be revivified. Hence, it is evidence that the perch is in this tradition the manifestation of the resurrection of the first holy world. It is the symbol of its new era and represents, in a somewhat altered form, antecedent, is its antecedent, the Didi pillar. The Didi pillar, the most sacred emblem of the perished world, would appear to have imparted the sanctity to the specific slip of reed. Consequently, the sanctity that was conferred on it would appear to have had its manifestation in the power which is defined in our sources as the action of the uplifting of the god. This sacred act, which is known to us from the Edfu narrative only, is the resurrection of a divine being. The rebirth of the divine nature of a god was the starting point in a new phase of creation of the earth from which this world was believed to have developed. It follows that the Egyptian belief was that the existence of the perch was the principal means by virtue of which the island could gradually be brought to a new life and to its former state. The perch was believed to impart sanctity to its nearest surroundings, and thus it was believed that the first sacred domain was created on the marginal land of the island of creation. This first domain created at the dawn of the new period of creation bears the name Wetcheset Neder. The manner in which it was created proves that it assumed and bore the function and the characteristics of its antecedent, the sacred domain of the Didi pillars, and vanished. Then, after the perch had been erected and the new divine being in the island had alighted upon it, the ancestral falcons were awakened from their slumber. They returned to the place where they formerly ruled in their spiritual forms. It is evident from the presence of the soul described as the flying Ba. Our hypothesis can furthermore be illustrated by the part which the ancestral deities played in the recreated domain of Wetcheset Neder. The narrative makes it clear that they came to appoint their successor, the falcon, and to protect him in his new home. The circumstances described reveal the importance of the field of reeds in Egyptian mythology. It was in a field of reeds that the first sacred domain was created and existed. When this domain vanished, the field of reeds was believed to have protected the funerary abode of its rulers. It was again in a field of reeds that life was renewed. In our creation story, it was in the field of reeds that the early divine generation of gods revealed themselves after its sanctity was revivified by the creation of the perch. In the same field of reeds, the first domain for the new divine being was founded. It follows that the field of reeds had vital significance in the origin of sacred places. Further illustrative evidence of the same thought can be found in the geographical list of the Pronaos at Edfu. The field of reeds is described in the following terms. Quote, he, in parentheses it says the king, brings the meadow of the divine dwellers, even the district of the ghosts which enshrines the reeds that gives new strength to the weak one. Interesting. End quote. There is a striking resemblance. I said striking. There is a striking resemblance between the definition of the field of reeds in the short text and the description of the domain of the ancestors in our creation story. The idea that the reed gives new vigor to the weak one seems to accord with the characteristics of the domain of Wetjesetneder, which is said to be TW squiggly TPYW dash apostrophe, or uplifting or restoring the ancestors. The idea evidently was that the field of reeds as a place with funerary associations was the only part of land in which the revivification of all that was dead could be effected. In connection with the texts in the Edfu geographical list, we have to remember that the field of reeds in the island of Trampling contained primarily the deity pillars upon which rested the deities governing the island. These are now the ancestors of the recreated sacred domain. As ancestor gods residing in their images on the deity pillars, they are the DDW ghosts. There is, therefore, reason for assuming that all these statements were inspired by the same tradition. A further deduction that can be made from these texts is that both allude to a deity who does not bear any specific name. Therefore, if our equation be correct, the PN god from the main Edfu document is to be linked with the GNN, or the weak one, in the spell quoted above. Hence, once again, we think of a tradition concerning a nameless deity who was believed to reside in a field of reeds, who died there, and whose mortuary image was hidden in the same field of reeds. He was subsequently reanimated by another divine power, also in the field of reeds. This brings to mind one of our hypotheses expressed above, that the first defunct deity in Egyptian mythology seems to have been an earth god. In view of all the evidence in the Edfu texts, we have no doubt that one of the vital thoughts of this cosmogonical theory is the idea of a revival and resurrection. The analysis of our document makes it clear that the first act of creation, which the two Shebtu completed in the island of Trampling, was solely an act of recreation of a divine world which once existed and which ended in darkness. At the beginning of this chapter, we suggested that it looks as though the Egyptians believed that the historical domains were founded on what existed in the past, on the grounds of a sacred world that perished. The facts yielded by the analysis of our sources confirm our surmise. Since it is known that the original inhabitants of the island of Trampling were the DRTY Falcons, and, moreover, since there is at Edfu explicit evidence that their realm was regarded as the territory of the ancestors, it is therefore clear that a land of ancestral tradition was the only place fitting for the foundation of a new sacred domain. The new phase of creation of sacred domains, however, was possible only after the vanished world was resurrected and was brought to its former state. There is consequently no doubt that the period of the primeval age in which the sacred domains which survived in historical times originated was definitely not regarded as the first period in the essence of the island of creation. It is also clear that the Edfu narrative starts at the moment when the second period of the primeval world of gods dawned. For the Egyptians, the recreation of the domain of the ancestors does not seem to be the result of a supernatural power which would act in a latent manner. The Edfu account shows that another creative power was needed in the revival of the domain of the ancestors, and it was this power that actually fashioned. It is evident that at the beginning of this act of recreation, it was necessary to constitute means which could bring the god, in the form of his living substitute, to his former state. Then and only then could the creation of further sacred domains be carried out. The revivification of the other primeval domain, which was believed to have existed in the island of Trampling during the first period of its existence, is also placed in the field of reeds described as the Wetjesetneder. This act was probably assigned to the same creative powers the Shebtu. It proceeds, however, on a somewhat different scale. It was, in fact, a real recreation and reconstruction of the former state of that domain, as will be seen below. This episode is said to have happened after the revelation of another earth god, who is Tannin. We have no doubt that in the brief allusions with which the first Edfu record begins, there is enshrined a myth about the restoration of the sacred domain of the Creator, an act which culminated in the origin of sacred domains of other divine beings. The analysis of the beginnings of the first Edfu record shows that it enshrines a complete, or rather, it shows that it enshrines a composite and manifold tradition. It permits us to gain a fairly clear idea of the essential parts of Egyptian cosmogonical doctrine. It enables us to reconstruct the picture of a very ancient domain which the Egyptians looked on as that of the creator of the earth, and believed that it once existed in the island of creation, but was destroyed. The narrative explains a good deal of the mythological circumstances with which the Egyptians seem to have surrounded the part of land in which the creation of this world began. It emerges from the Edfu accounts that the Egyptians believed in two distinct eras in which the earth was created, each of which represented, on the other hand, a definite part in the history of their sacred places. Strictly speaking, it was the first period of the creation that the foundation ground of this world was created. This then was conceived as being the sacred domain of the creator of the earth. The second phase of the creation was then the restoration of the domain of the earth god and the era of the origin of the historical domains. Our records proceed to give a quite detailed account of the means which brought the domain of the earth god to its former state. Our main Edfu sources undoubtedly convey views of general significance and application. The statement that a first world created when light was first made was destroyed accords with one of the major ideas of Egyptian cosmogony. At this point, we see a link between the fate of the island, as it is known from the Edfu sources, and a thought expressed in the Book of the Dead, spell 175. According to the latter, the earth, after it was created, disappeared beneath the primeval waters. The Edfu account, therefore, adds many detail to this view and, moreover, gives it a dramatic context. The first creation can be regarded, from the point of view of the tradition implicit in our documents, as the history of the homeland of the primeval ones. In the history of this domain, the allusions to the fall of the sound eye, the Wa-Ret, the underworld of the soul, and the revelation of the ancestor gods are all valuable pieces of evidence that this homeland ended in darkness and beneath the primeval waters. It is of interest that in the second period, a new generation of the creators of the earth appeared on the scene. The creator of the earth does not seem to have acted himself, but was replaced by other deities who are described as his progeny. The main, indeed the exclusive concern of the creation performed during the second phase was again the creation of the earth. The interpretation of the origin of animate beings appears definitely foreign to this doctrine. Hence, it is not unreasonable to conclude that the Edfu myth of creation was inspired by a doctrine whose sole concern was the origin of terrestrial substances and their intimate derivatives. Boom. And that is that. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we did really good. We're almost halfway through now. 2 hours. So when I go live again tomorrow with this, I think I'm just gonna be doing one chapter because it's very long. But tomorrow, when we get back into this, we're gonna be doing part 3, the second era of the primeval age. And chapter 9 is the origin of the lands used as sacred domains. Dang. Wow. This stuff is so interesting. All these cultures, so much earlier than us. Wow. So dang, I hope you guys are having a great weekend. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thanks for checking this out. Yeah, I'm maybe I'll see you guys around on somebody's live somewhere tonight. But yeah, we'll see what shakes. But I sure do appreciate you. So yeah, big hugs. Rah! And thank you, YouTube. Thank you, StreamYard. Thank you, family. Thank you, God. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Mwah. Take care of yourselves. Thank you so much.